All right, folks, we have got about 45 minutes, so that should give me a decent amount of time to start this material, and should be able to finish it by the end of class on Tuesday. My original plan was to reserve some class time on Tuesday for you guys to have an opportunity to do another one of these extra credit exercises. It involves looking at some actual data on per capita real GDP in the US economy over time. So it's going to involve an Excel spreadsheet, and then you would just answer some straightforward questions based on that data. If I don't have enough time to let you guys work on that for a while in class on Tuesday, I'll let you take it as homework, and then you can simply email your spreadsheet answer to me by Thursday, and I'll look at it and attach some extra credit points to your next midterm exam, okay? I'm just not sure how much time out of lecture I'm going to need to get through the material here. Okay, we are now ready to move to a new topic in this class. So the last couple of weeks, we have been discussing topics that are directly related to macroeconomics. But really what we've done so far is we've just concentrated on measurement concepts or measurement issues. That is looking at how certain types of macroeconomic data are constructed, right? In particular, gross domestic product as a measure of economic activity, and the CPI as a measure of the cost of living. What we want to start doing in class today is to go beyond these simple kind of measurement issues and start studying the forces that actually drive these macroeconomic variables over time. In particular, what we're going to look at is this issue of long-run economic growth, which is really all about studying the forces that drive real GDP higher over time. That's what we mean by economic growth. Okay, so what we're essentially ready to do now then is to start thinking about how the macroeconomy actually works. And we want to think about how to formalize these ideas in the context of like a coherent macroeconomic model, right? So we've talked about the data for a while now. Now we're going to move on to starting to think about actually building macroeconomic models that describe how these variables behave over time. In this section of the course, which I think corresponds to chapter 12 of the Man-Q textbook, we're going to examine in more detail the causes of improved living standards over time. That's typically what economists mean by economic growth, are the forces that cause material standards of well-being or living standards to increase over time, okay? Now, our measure of standard of living that we're going to focus on is one that you're already familiar with. It's per capita real GDP. In other words, it's the amount of real output or income per person or divided by the population in a particular economy. Okay, now per capita real GDP is not a perfect or flawless indicator of a country's standard of living. Right? We spent some time a week or so ago talking about why that is the case, right? One obvious one is that GDP doesn't tell us much about the distribution of incomes, okay? But it's still the variable that is most focused on and most discussed when trying to measure economic growth outcomes across the world. And so that's the one we're going to focus on today. So this discussion, this part of the course basically has, the outline has kind of three parts, all right? The first thing I want to do is show you guys, to try to motivate these topics, I want to show you guys some actual international data on per capita real GDP across different countries. So we're not just going to look at the US experience. We're going to compare
Yo.
what's happened in the US relative to a bunch of other countries, okay? This is going to give you hopefully an appreciation for how
Nice.
radically different living standards are from one country to the next.
Dude, after I get this done, I'm not done till Sunday. Like, I'm literally just watching this, listening to it. So I'm very excited. Yeah, I'm gonna smoke myself a bowl. Gonna do some stats tonight. I'll stay up late night.
Did I do that right? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I want you guys to have an appreciation for how different living standards are from one country to the next across the globe. I don't want us to just focus on the U.S. economy. It's also going to help show us how different the growth rates of these different countries are. So in some countries, living standards are actually growing rapidly. But in other countries, living standards aren't growing much at all. Sometimes the growth rates are negative. So we're going to take a little bit more of a detailed look at that. The second part of this chapter is we're going to start to examine the role that productivity plays in trying to explain these cross-country income differences, okay? This goes back to one of those 10 big ideas in economics that was in the first chapter of this course, right? Typically, we think that differences in standards of living are driven primarily by differences in the productivity of the workforce from one country to the next. And so we'll examine that idea a little bit more closely. And then lastly, if productivity is really the driver of long-run growth, then I think it's probably appropriate for us to spend a little bit of time talking about certain types of government policies or programs or institutions that might enhance productivity growth, right? Because these are the ones that can improve living standards in the long run. Okay, any questions then before we get started on this? So let me begin by showing you guys some, I think there's some compelling facts or statistics that will help you gain a deeper appreciation, I think, for just how very important long-run economic growth is. It's probably the most important topic or issue in the entire discipline of macroeconomics, okay? Here's one example of these types of statistics that helps clarify that. So in 2018, you may not know this, but there were 228 malaria cases reported worldwide. And an estimated 405,000 people died from malaria. And most of those deaths were among African children. Now, preventing these types of death, preventing this type of public health disaster really only requires one thing: economic growth, okay? Indeed, other countries, other continents experienced problems with malaria in parts of their history, including parts of the United States. Parts of Central America, parts of South America had problems with malaria and high death rates a long time ago, okay? But those parts of the world experienced much more rapid economic growth, and along with that growth, the general kind of level of poverty declined in those countries, and incomes rose, and they were able to better afford things like medications, better prevention techniques, pesticides, whatever the case may be, to actually eliminate malaria as a public health problem, okay? This idea that health and wealth kind of go together, are correlated, holds for lots of different health-related statistics, all right? Let me show you guys another one on the next slide here that shows kind of a relationship between how rich a country is along with the child or infant mortality rate, okay? So here's a graph. It's a scatter plot here that shows a bunch of different countries across the world. On the vertical axis here, you have real GDP per capita, all right? Now it's measured in US dollars. So we're talking about a bunch of different countries here, and so their real per capita GDPs have been converted to US dollars using exchange rates. On the horizontal axis, we have, what do we have? The number of children surviving to age 5 per 1,000 live births. So it is a measure of infant mortality, okay? Each dot on this scatter plot shows a specific country, and it graphs the infant mortality rate with that country's per capita real GDP. You can probably already tell the size of the circle tells us something about how populous that country is, right? So China is a huge circle here, and India, US is pretty big, but then we've got a bunch of smaller countries like North Korea, Nigeria, etc. All right. Now, what do you guys, just a kind of a casual glance of this at this figure, what do you see as the correlation between standards of living as measured by per capita real GDP and this infant mortality rate? It's not an exact correspondence, but it looks to me like countries that tend to have higher levels of per capita incomes are also those same countries that tend to have much higher infant survival rates, right? Take Italy, for example. So this is one of the richest countries in the world. Fewer than 5 children, maybe only about 3 children per 1,000 live births die before the age of 5, okay? Contrast that with Liberia or Nigeria, where the per capita incomes are much, much lower. It's a much more impoverished nation. And in fact, in Liberia, some 1 out of every 5 children don't even make it until age 5. So you see here how profoundly important economic growth is, right? Now, all the foreign aid, all of the medication, all of the treatment plans that we can offer through these international organizations like the World Bank or the IMF, all of those things are great, okay? But truthfully, they just treat the symptoms. They don't actually treat the underlying problems, right? The cure for things like malaria deaths or high infant mortality rates is economic growth, right? If we can figure out the right types of policies or economic institutions that are most conducive to long-run economic growth, then the benefits for human welfare, if you think about it, can be staggering, right? Instead of 20% of children dying before the age of 5, you can have something like only 2 or 3 out of 1,000 passing away, a much, much more rare event. Okay, you guys have any questions then about that? All of that was not to gross you out or frighten you. I'm trying to help you guys gain a little bit more of an appreciation for actually how important economic growth is. You know, our politicians and policymakers talk about trying to grow the economy, right? And people kind of sometimes take it seriously, sometimes not. But in fact, economic growth for these other countries that are far poorer than the United States is a hugely important thing, right? Just a few $1,000s more per year in per capita incomes can dramatically lower human suffering, okay? And so that's why I would argue, and many macroeconomists would argue, that the study of economic growth is probably the most important topic in the field of macroeconomics. Okay, let me take a few minutes now and show you guys some specific international data so you guys can get a feel for how different living standards are across the globe. So I've selected, I think this is 14 or 15 countries from across the world, and I went out on so this data is collected from the Penn World Tables, which I believe is published by the World Bank. The first column of data shows per capita real GDP in 2019. Again, all of these are measured in US dollars using exchange rates. And the last column over here shows the average annual growth rate of real GDP, per capita real GDP in each of these countries. Now, I've ordered the countries in descending order according to their growth rates. So the fastest growing countries are at the top, the slowest growing countries are at the bottom, okay? Let's focus on the per capita GDP data first, okay? Now, if you all just take a look at those numbers, and again, you do not have to memorize these, but I want you to have a general idea about how different they are. Just by quickly glancing at those, would you say that living standards vary greatly or not much at all from one country to the next? A lot, yeah, greatly. So take a country like, well, the United States. Per capita incomes was around $63,000 a year last year, okay? Compare that to, oh, I don't know, Rwanda, around $2,000 in real per capita income per year. So the United States has an average standard of living that is what, 30 times higher than the typical person from Rwanda? That's enormous, okay? The difference in human suffering between the typical American, even a poor one, and the typical Rwandan, even a relatively well-off one, is staggering, okay? So living standards are hugely different across countries, all right? Now, they're not so different in very similar countries, like compare the US to, where'd the United States go? To Canada. We're a little bit richer than Canada, but it's not anything compared to like the US versus Rwanda, okay? Or Chad, as an example. Take a look at India. So India is one of these kind of rapidly developing countries. Here's another way to kind of slice the data. India's per capita real GDP is around $6,700 per year. To give you an idea about how much that is, the United States per capita real GDP was around $6,700 a year way back in like the 1930s, I believe. Okay, so what I'm saying is that India today has average incomes and standards of living that haven't been experienced in the developed world in almost 100 years. Okay, so again, there are huge differences in living standards from one country to the next. Our goal over the next couple of weeks is to try to understand why that is. And we're ultimately going to build a formal model of long-run economic growth that can help us understand what those reasons are. Let's look at the growth rates for just a couple of minutes. What do you notice here? So not only are standards of living very different from one country to the next, but in fact, the growth rates of these countries vary dramatically. So across the globe, we have some rich countries, we have some middle-income countries, and some poor countries. But we also have some countries that are growing very rapidly. Some of those countries are rich, some of those countries are poor. And we also have some countries that are growing very slowly, if at all. And some of those countries are not necessarily all poor. Some of them are kind of in the middle of the income distribution. So there's a lot of variation in how quickly these different countries are growing, right? I'm sure you guys have heard of all the stories about growth in China. It's been enormous the past 30 years, that China has grown at an average annual rate of around 8 to 9% per year, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but the average is around 8.5 or so. India has also had a very rapid growth rate. Compare that to the US's growth rate of per capita income. 1.5%, much, much slower than what we see in China or India or even Rwanda. Rwanda's been growing at 4% per year, despite the fact that they're far poorer than we are. I didn't mention this, by the way, but don't make the mistake of thinking that the United States is the richest country in the world on a per capita basis. We're actually not. I think we're ranked maybe 7th, 6th or 7th, something like that. Singapore actually has a higher per capita income level. Now, it's a very small country compared to the US, but there's a handful of others that actually have higher levels of GDP per person. I think the United States does have the highest level of total GDP of any country in the world. Maybe China is close, but on a per capita basis, the United States is outside of the top 5, I believe. Okay, one implication of this large amount of variation you see in the growth rates of standards of living that I want to emphasize here for a few minutes is that just because a country is rich today, like let's say the United States, for instance, does not necessarily mean that that country is going to be rich relative to the rest of the world, let's say 50 or 100 years from now. If the United States grows very slowly over the next 50 years, we might not be one of the richest countries in the world anymore, right? So rich countries cannot rest on their laurels, right? They still want to try to seek high economic growth if they want to stay among the highest living standards globally. But more importantly, poor countries are not necessarily going to be mired in poverty forever. If Rwanda can maintain about a 4% growth rate, which is over twice as high as the United States, they're going to quickly start to catch up to some of these other countries in standards of living over time. And in 50 years' time, the ranking of these countries according to their standards of living may be actually very different. This graph here kind of illustrates this point nicely. So I picked 5 countries: the US, Japan, South Korea, Argentina, and Nigeria, okay? And what I've graphed here is each of these countries' per capita real GDP values from 1960 through 2019, I believe. Again, using the data from the World Bank. If the line has a steep slope, then obviously growth has been rapid in that country. If it has a much lower slope, then growth has been very low, if not quite minimal, okay? Take a look at Japan. Japan was not one of the richest, necessarily the richest countries in the world way back in 1960. But from 1960 through 1990, Japan actually had the fastest growth rate of any country on planet Earth. And as a result, they actually overtook the US in per capita income levels briefly during the 1990s. Now, some stuff has happened in Japan since the early 90s, which has caused their growth rates to be much lower. In fact, if you guys go back to this, you'll see Japan has the lowest growth rate now of any of these 14 countries. So Japan grew really rapidly, and now they're growing much slower. Take a look at South Korea. Used to be one of the poorest countries in the world in 1960. It grew rapidly and is now among one of the world's richest countries. Look at Argentina. Argentina was relatively well off back in the 50s and 60s. They were kind of in the middle of the world income distribution. Argentina has been an economic basket case for a century, okay, and hasn't experienced hardly any growth as a result of it. And today, Argentina is a relatively poor nation. Why? What explains Argentina's experience compared to South Korea, right? Argentina used to be a lot richer than South Korea. South Korea grew rapidly, and now the typical South Korean has a much higher standard of living than the typical Argentinian. So just because countries are poor today does not mean they're going to be poor in the future. It all depends on how quickly they tend to grow over time. Nigeria is another example that has just experienced virtually no growth in the long run. Okay, you guys have any questions then about the international data? All that compelling and makes some sense? Okay, so in light of these numbers that we've been looking at for the last several minutes here, the central questions that I want you all to start thinking about over the next couple of weeks is, one, why are some countries richer than others? Why do we see this huge variation in living standards across countries? 2, why do some countries tend to grow quickly, like China or India, while others seem to be stuck in this poverty trap forever, like Nigeria? Or why does a country like Argentina have such sclerotic growth for so long? I think understanding the answers to these questions are profoundly important for human welfare, right? If we can figure out why countries are rich and why some countries are poor, and we can mimic the policies of the rich world in the poor world, then we can dramatically reduce global poverty and improve material standards of well-being for everybody. And so that's kind of the last question that I want to get to, and I won't get to this until the next class, and that is, what policies may actually help raise long-run growth rates and therefore living standards over time? Are there certain ones that are better to focus on than others? Okay, so let me spend some time now examining the role of productivity. So we didn't talk about this on the first day of class. I had you guys kind of review it on your own. But one of those 10 kind of major ideas in economics is this idea that a country's standard of living really depends on its ability to produce goods and services, okay? Countries that have a better ability to produce goods and services are going to have higher standards of living, okay? Now, this ability to produce goods and services is generically what we call productivity, okay? It's essentially the average quantity of goods and services produced per unit of labor in a country, okay? In terms of the variables that we've introduced in this class, if Y is real GDP, that's the quantity of real goods and services that we produce. It's also equal to the amount of real income that we generate in a country. And L, let's say, is the quantity of labor. You might even think of it as being kind of like the population level of a country. Then productivity is going to be defined as output per worker, Y divided by L. All right, so we can quantify this concept of productivity by taking a country's real GDP level and dividing it by the number of workers, or the number of work hours, if you will. It's the number of units of labor. All right, this is how we think about productivity. And so, you know, at a very simple level, why a country like the United States has a higher standard of living than its neighbor to the south, Mexico, is because in the United States, output per worker, that is the productivity of the typical US worker, is going to be higher than the productivity of the average worker from Mexico. All right, let me spend a couple of minutes talking about why productivity is so important for understanding growth in living standards. So when workers are very productive, or when workers' productivity is rising, okay, then that means your average employee is producing more real goods and services per hour of his or her time, okay? When that happens, then real output and real incomes are going to rise in a nation. And so real GDP is going to be higher, all right? Now, as workers become more productive, you can imagine that their real wages are also going to rise. In the long run, the real value of your wages is tied closely to the real value of the output of goods and services that you actually produce, right? Someone that has a really high real wage is very likely going to be someone whose market value of the goods or services they produce is also very high, okay? And so when worker productivity rises and the value of the goods and services that we're producing goes up as a result of that, workers are going to be able to command higher wages over time. Therefore, incomes are going to go up. Therefore, real GDP is going to go up by even more. It kind of reinforces itself, okay? That's why productivity is so important, okay? Now, all of this, hopefully you guys are kind of catching on to this. So far in this discussion, this all kind of raises an obvious question, right? I've talked about productivity now for several minutes and how important that is. And this idea that rich countries have more productive workers than poor countries. But all of that raises an obvious question, and that is, what is it that's really determining or driving how productive workers are? Why are workers in the United States so much more productive, let's say, than workers in India? Why are we able to produce a higher dollar value of goods and services per hour than the average Indian worker, right? So if the way I like to think about it here is that productivity is kind of like the proximate cause of living standards. But what is the root cause of higher living standards? That is, what are those things, those forces in the economy that are actually driving productivity higher in the long run? That's what I want to spend the last 15 minutes of class talking about today, okay? Now, economists generally recognize 4 drivers of productivity. I don't think one of them is very important, and so I actually have eliminated from the slides. So I'm going to just talk about 3. So when I get to the slide that I'm going to skip, you guys can just delete that slide, okay? But one of the most important determinants of how productive workers are is traces back to physical capital, or how much physical capital workers actually have at their disposal, what I call physical capital per worker. Now, let's be clear about the definition here. All right, what do we mean by physical capital? This is the stock of equipment and structures and machinery and tools that are used in the workplace to actually produce goods and services. Now, earlier in the semester, we may have just called this capital and not modified it with this term physical. All right, I'm going to call this physical capital here because in a few minutes, I'm going to contrast it with a different type of capital, okay? Physical capital is very tangible. It's the equipment and the tools that we actually use to produce goods and services. I'm going to denote this variable with a K. That's kind of standard in economics, okay? The basic idea here is that when capital per worker goes higher, that increases the productivity of the typical worker and therefore raises output per worker and raises living standards. So an increase in capital per worker is what drives increases in output per, is one of the things that drives increases in output per worker over time, right? If you give the same number of workers a greater stock of capital to use, right, that is capital per worker goes up, then presumably they should be able to produce more goods and services, right? A cook in a restaurant that has one oven is not going to be able to produce as many meals per hour as the same cook that has 2 ovens in the kitchen, right? The addition of this extra oven, that is a capital good, enables the cook to produce more meals. Simple concept, right? So the greater the stock of capital, the more productive workers are going to become, okay? So this is one, not the only one, but it is one of the reasons why US workers are far more productive than workers in some other countries, is because if you take the typical employee in the US workforce, that person is going to have access to more and a larger variety of different types of physical capital with which to produce goods and services. And so is going to be more productive, command higher wages and higher incomes. Now, one thing I should stress here that I don't have in the slides is that capital is actually a produced factor of production, right? What do I mean by that? That capital is used to produce other goods and services. But that capital was actually once an output of the production process, right? The cook's oven is used to make restaurant meals today. But that oven itself was actually produced, was an output of the production process at some point in the past. The reason I bring this up is because if a country wants to raise its productivity by increasing the capital stock, it simply has to devote more of its resources to producing capital instead of other types of goods, like consumption goods, right? So policies that are geared towards producing capital might actually help us promote long-run growth and productivity. I want you guys to think about that when we have our discussion next week. Okay, there is another important driver of worker productivity, and that is what's called human capital, which I'm going to denote with the letter H. Now, human capital is different than physical capital. It is intangible. It's not something physical that you can actually touch, okay? Human capital is defined as the knowledge and the skills that workers experience through things like education, training, on-the-job experience, even social interaction can help build our human capital, okay? The idea here is that workers' productivity will go up if the amount of human capital per worker is also rising, okay? So an increase in human capital for each worker in the economy is going to raise output per worker and therefore raise living standards, okay? An example, a CPA that has an accounting degree from, I don't know, a top business school somewhere in this country is probably going to be able to process more tax returns per hour, let's say, than someone who has than an anthropology major. I'm not picking on anthropology majors, but someone who has no experience with that, right? So the right type of education or training, or what we call human capital, enables individuals to be more productive. If I go back to my silly little cook and oven example, if I've got a cook that is a chef that is trained at one of the finest culinary schools around, he or she is going to be able to prepare more, restaurant quality meals per hour than someone who has no training in that whatsoever. That's an example where additional human capital can improve productivity and therefore raise living standards. I think this is an important one. One of the biggest reasons why people are rich in this country and people are poor in other countries is because our workers in this country have a much higher level of human capital, okay? That's why you guys are at college, right? You're trying to get educated, trying to get trained. A big part of college, by the way, is the social interaction, right? In our professional world now, those types of what we call social capital are really important, right? In most of these professions these days, working in groups or teams, being able to express your ideas to a larger audience, being able to take or give constructive criticism, all of those skills are built in a social atmosphere. And that's a big part of college is meeting a diverse bunch of people and developing that social capital, okay? All of those things are important and help US workers become more productive over time. Here's a good article in the Wall Street Journal that talks exactly about that, human capital and the changing nature of work. Okay, I'm gonna skip the slide on natural resources. I don't think natural resources are all that important in determining productivity, because the reality of it is that there are a lot of countries out there that aren't rich in natural resources, but yet they have high levels of productivity among their workers. And so I think among the four that are in that I've got in these slides, this is probably the natural resources are probably the least important. So I'm actually just going to skip it. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, if you want to delete that, I'm not going to ask you anything about that. I just think there are more important topics. In fact, this one here, in my opinion, is the most important. The thing that drives productivity higher and higher in the long run is not just physical and human capital, but what this kind of abstract concept that macroeconomists describe as technological knowledge. Okay, now what do I mean by this? Technological knowledge is society's understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. It's basically our blueprint for how we transform inputs into outputs. It's the stock of ideas that we have about the production process. It's not just things like a faster computer or a more high-def TV or a cell phone that has a faster processor. Those are related to technology, but that's not really what we mean. What we're talking about are the ideas about the production process. When technology improves, you can take the same amount of capital and labor and suddenly produce more output, okay? Some modern examples of technological advances, I think, are things like advances in supply chain management, all right, mobile email, even social media. One that we've witnessed during the whole COVID crisis is remote work through, faster. Remote work is now enabled through faster broadband connections among everyone, right? So these kinds of things are improvements in technology that allow us to produce more goods and services per unit of our time. I've got 5 minutes left, and so I'm gonna stop here and actually show you guys this video called Secrets from the Potato Chip Factory. It's only a couple minutes long, but it does a better job of describing technological progress than I could ever do, okay? So it's just a video that lasts a few minutes, and then I'll let you guys go for the day.
If you took a bag of chips today that we
Okay,
sell in the
I'm gonna
supermarket
need to raise
and
the
you tried
volume,
to make
right?
it with the process that we used back in 1946, you would have to charge about $25 because it would take 10 times the amount of.
Okay, let me start over there. All right.
If you took a bag of chips today that we sell in the supermarkets and you tried to make it with the process that we used back in 1946, you would have to charge about $25 because it would take 10 times the amount of labor. When the company first started, it was in a little barn, very labor intensive operation. It's kind of the opposite today. There were 3 or 4 of us working on unloading. And today, it takes one person. First of all, the trailer comes in and backs up on a scale that weighs the truck. And then this scale lifts up with the tractor trailer on it and dumps the potatoes into the conveyor. We want to sell potato chips that are white, golden white. So what we do is we pick out the ones that are a little off color. Years ago, we used to pick them out by hand. Today, we have this machine taking pictures of every chip that's on that conveyor. And then it communicates those pictures to thousands of little air jets. These little air jets shoot out the ones that are brown or sunburnt. Then the rest of them go on and go into the package. The first packages were formed, stapled, and put in a box by hand. And that was one of my mother's first jobs. When we run these packing machines today, the packaging is coming in big rolls, and they put it on the back of this machine. And then as the chips fall down, the machine pulls the package down, and it heat seals it. And it happens so fast. It's just like that we're doing 100 of these packages in every minute. When we first started in business, we would do about 5 to 10 pounds of potatoes or potato chips in an hour. Today, with all the equipment and technology, we make between 5 and 6 tons of potato chips every hour.
Okay, I told you it was short. So hopefully that kind of illustrates this idea about technological knowledge, and how that's, in my estimation, that among the three that we talked about today is probably the most important for determining productivity in the long run. So as technology improves, productivity improves, and living standards grow. So here's what we're going to do in the next class. I'm hopefully I can get through the last part of the slides in like 20 or 30 minutes. And what I'd like to do is give you guys the rest of the time to work this extra credit exercise. I will post the assignment before class on Blackboard, so you can just upload it from your computer directly. But you'll need to make sure you have like a working Excel program or some type of spreadsheet software to work through the problems. And then it's pretty straightforward. You can fill that out and then hand it in to me for extra credit. Okay? Have a good weekend.